An omega without a voice is nothing, the Alpha King said, and the room agreed before she ever had the chance to prove them wrong. The great hall of Nightfall stretched wide and cold, polished stone floors reflecting the golden firelight from chandeliers that hung 30 feet above, each flame flickering like 1,000 watchful eyes, and Elena Whitmore stood at the far edge of it all, fingers curled tightly into the thin fabric of her sleeve, her breath shallow, her throat already aching with a silence she had carried her entire life. A silence that pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, louder than any scream. She could never release. And as the court gathered, silks whispering, boots echoing, power humming in the air like a storm about to break, she felt it again. That familiar weight of being unseen, of being less, of being the space between words no one cared to hear. And yet tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was the choosing, the moment the Alpha King would name his Luna, and though no one had invited her forward, though her stepmother's warning still echoed, stay in the shadows, do not be seen, Elena had stepped into the light anyway, drawn by something she couldn't explain, something that pulsed deep in her chest whenever she felt his presence near, something that whispered not in sound, but in warmth, in instinct, in a quiet certainty that refused to die even after years of being told she was nothing. And then he moved, Lucian Blackthorn, the Alpha King, tall and still as winter, his presence alone enough to silence an entire room, his silver eyes scanning the crowd with a calm that felt sharper than any blade. And when those eyes passed over her, just for a second, Elena's breath caught, her heart stuttering as if it recognized him in a way her mind could not explain, and she stepped forward before she could stop herself. One step, then another, the sound of her shoes barely audible against the stone, but loud enough in her own ears that it felt like thunder, and someone laughed, soft at first, then louder, until the sound spread like ripples through the court, and she froze, heat rising to her cheeks, her fingers trembling as she tried to speak, to say anything, to offer even a single word to justify her presence, but nothing came. Not a whisper, not a breath shaped into sound, just that same empty silence that had followed her since birth, and the laughter grew sharper, crueler, and Lucian's gaze returned, not curious, not kind, but cold, assessing, final, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily across the hall, steady and unyielding. An omega without a voice is not fit to stand before me. And the words landed, heavier than anything thrown at her before, because they were not shouted, not filled with anger, just truth as he saw it, absolute and unchallenged, and something inside Elena cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like ice giving way beneath still water, and she lowered her eyes, swallowing against a throat that would never answer, her chest tightening as the bond she had never understood flickered painfully, as if something deep within her reached for him one last time and found nothing in return. And the guard stepped forward, not roughly, not cruelly, but firmly enough to guide her back into the shadows where she belonged, where she had always belonged. And as the light faded from her skin and the voices of the court swallowed her whole, Elena Whitmore disappeared without a sound, leaving behind only the echo of a silence no one had ever bothered to hear. The night air outside the great hall felt colder than it should have, sharp against Elena Whitmore's skin as she stepped beyond the towering doors and into the open courtyard, the echoes of laughter still clinging to her like something she could not wash away. And for a moment she simply stood there, staring at the stone beneath her feet as if it might open and swallow her whole, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, her throat tightening again with that same familiar pressure, that same silent scream that had never once found its way into the world. And she pressed her hand lightly against her collarbone, as if she could steady whatever was breaking inside her before it showed on her face. Because even now, even after everything, she refused to cry where anyone could see, refused to give them that satisfaction. And yet her fingers trembled anyway, betraying her, tracing the faint warmth that lingered beneath her skin, the strange pull that had led her into the hall in the first place, the same pull that now ached like something unfinished, something denied. And behind her, the music resumed, softer now, distant, as if the world had already moved on without her, as if she had never stepped into that light at all. And perhaps that was the truth. Perhaps she had never belonged there to begin with. Perhaps she had only imagined that fleeting moment when his eyes met hers. Imagined the way her heartbeat had shifted, as though something deep within her had recognized him. And the thought made her chest tighten further, because recognition meant nothing if it was not returned. And she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself, before turning away from the palace. Her steps quiet against the gravel path as she moved toward the outer gates, toward the place she had always known she would return to eventually. The edge of everything, where the grand walls gave way to forest and shadow and silence, and no one expected anything from her, and no one listened, and no one judged, and the guards at the gate barely glanced her way as she passed. Just another Omega slipping out into the night, unnoticed, unremarkable, forgotten before she had even fully gone, and the forest welcomed her the way it always did, with a stillness that felt honest, the scent of pine and earth, grounding her as she stepped beneath the canopy, the moonlight filtering through the branches in soft, shifting patterns that brushed against her skin like a quiet reassurance, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction as the noise of the court faded completely behind her, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own breathing, and something else, something deeper, something she had never been able to explain, a warmth that began low in her chest and spread outward, subtle at first, then stronger, like a pulse that did not belong to her body alone. And she closed her eyes, letting it rise, letting it fill the empty space where her voice should have been, and for the first time that night, the tightness in her throat eased, not because she had found words, but because she no longer needed them, because out here, in the quiet, she could feel everything without speaking, could reach outward in ways no one had ever taught her. And as her fingers brushed lightly against the trunk of a nearby tree, she felt it, a faint echo in return, a connection that shimmered just beneath the surface of the world, soft but undeniable. And her breath caught, not in pain this time, but in something else, something fragile and new. And somewhere far behind her, inside the palace walls, the Alpha King stood among voices and power and expectation, while the one presence that had answered something within him slipped further into the shadows, unnoticed, unheard. And for the first time since the ceremony began, something inside him shifted, subtle and unsettling, like a silence he could not quite explain, but could no longer ignore. Something was wrong, and Lucian Blackthorn felt it before he could name it, before logic could catch up to instinct, before reason could explain why the air inside his own hull suddenly felt too still, too quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. And as the music carried on and voices rose around him in practiced celebration, he stood unmoving at the center of it all, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as a faint pressure settled behind his ribs, subtle but persistent, like a thread, pulled too tight, like something that had been there moments ago and was now gone. And he turned his head just enough to scan the crowd again, silver eyes sharp, searching without knowing exactly what he was looking for. And it made no sense, because everything was as it should be. The strongest alphas gathered, alliances forming, power shifting in quiet negotiations, the night unfolding exactly as planned, and yet the imbalance remained. A quiet absence that pressed against his awareness with growing insistence, and his fingers curled slightly at his side, an unconscious reaction to something deeper, something older than thought, something tied not to the crown on his head, but to the wolf beneath his skin, restless now in a way that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with loss. And that word lingered longer than it should have, because he had not lost anything. Had he? Nothing of value, nothing he had claimed, and yet the sensation did not fade. It sharpened, until even the steady rhythm of his own breathing felt off, incomplete, and he exhaled slowly, steadying himself before stepping away from the center of the hall, ignoring the subtle shifts in attention that followed his movement, ignoring the way conversations paused just enough to mark his absence, because for the first time that night, the court no longer held his focus. And as he moved toward the far edge of the room, toward the place where the shadows gathered between pillars and torchlight, his gaze caught on something small, almost insignificant, a space left open where someone had stood not long ago, and the memory surfaced without invitation, a girl stepping forward, quiet, trembling, her eyes lifted despite everything that told her not to, and the echo of his own voice followed, calm, final, dismissing her with a certainty that now felt less like truth and more like something incomplete. And he stopped, just for a second, his brow tightening as the image lingered longer than it should have, because he had seen many Omegas, had dismissed many as unworthy, and none had stayed in his thoughts beyond the moment they were gone, and yet this one had. This one left behind something he could not name, something that had settled into the edges of his awareness like a whisper he could not hear, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. And without fully deciding to, he turned toward the open doors of the hall, toward the night beyond, the cool air brushing against his skin as he stepped outside, the shift immediate, the weight in his chest easing just enough to confirm what instinct had already begun to suspect, that whatever he had lost, whatever had been there moments ago, was no longer within those walls, and his gaze lifted toward the distant tree line, the dark silhouette of the forest stretching beyond the reach of torchlight, and something deep within him stirred again, not restless this time, but drawn, pulled in a direction he had not consciously chosen, and he stood there for a moment longer, listening not with his ears, but with something far quieter, something that did not rely on sound. And for the first time in his life, Lucian Blackthorn felt the unmistakable presence of a silence that was not empty, but calling, and it was coming from the shadows he had just turned his back on. The forest did not welcome him the way it had welcomed her, and Lucian Blackthorn felt at the moment his boots crossed beyond the last line of stone and into the uneven ground of roots and fallen leaves, the air shifting, heavier somehow, as if the trees themselves were aware of his presence and chose to watch rather than embrace. And he slowed, not out of hesitation, but because the pull inside him sharpened, more precise now, guiding him forward in a way that had nothing to do with sight or sound, and everything to do with something deeper, something that brushed against his awareness like a faint current beneath still water, and he followed it, each step measured, deliberate, his gaze moving through shadows that seemed to shift just out of reach, the faint silver glow of the moon filtering through branches high above, casting narrow beams of light that barely touched the forest floor. And still, he felt it, stronger now, that quiet presence he had first noticed in its absence. And his chest tightened again, not with discomfort this time, but with recognition, as if some part of him had already accepted what the rest of him had yet to understand. And then he stopped, because the pull settled, not ahead, not behind, but right here, surrounding him, threading through the air in a way that made the silence feel alive. And he closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in weakness, but in focus, allowing that unfamiliar awareness to guide him. And there, beneath it all, he felt her, not her voice, not a sound, but a presence that reached outward without words, soft yet undeniable, like warmth spreading through cold air. And when his eyes opened again, he saw her, not clearly at first, just a shape between trees, still, unmoving, as if she had always been part of the forest itself. And something inside him shifted again, more forcefully now, a certainty forming where confusion had been, and he took a step forward, then another, the distance between them closing slowly, carefully, as if the moment itself demanded precision, and she did not run, did not retreat, but neither did she move toward him, her figure remaining exactly where it was, her presence steady, grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the unrest that had driven him here. And when he finally stood close enough to see her clearly, Elena Whitmore lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his without fear, without expectation, just quiet awareness, and the silence between them changed, no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but filled with something neither of them could ignore. And for the first time since he had spoken those words in the hall, Lucian found himself without an answer, without the easy certainty that had defined him for so long. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, just slightly as he studied her, really studied her, noticing now what he had overlooked before, the steadiness in her stance, the calm in her expression, the way the air around her seemed to hum with something he could feel but not yet understand, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, not commanding, not dismissive, but searching. Why do I feel you, even when you do not speak? And the question lingered between them, unanswered in words, but not in meaning, because the moment he spoke, That warmth rose again, stronger this time, brushing against him with a clarity that made his breath catch. And Elena did not open her mouth, did not force sound where none would come, but instead she stepped forward, just once, closing the final space between them, and lifted her hand slowly, hesitantly, until her fingers hovered just inches from his chest, not touching, but close enough that he felt it. A pulse that was not his own, steady, unwavering, and in that instant, Lucian Blackthorn understood something that no voice could have taught him, that silence was not absence, and that the one he had dismissed as nothing was the only one who had ever reached him at all. Lucian did not move when her hand hovered inches from his chest, but his breath shifted, slower now, deeper, as if something within him had begun to listen in a way it never had before, and the space between them felt charged, not with tension, but with recognition, something quiet and undeniable that settled into his bones without asking permission. And he realized then that this was what had been missing, not power, not control, but this steady presence that did not demand, did not push, but simply existed and reached him all the same. And Elena felt it too. The way his energy, once sharp and distant, now softened at the edges, no longer pressing against her, but meeting her halfway. And her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being acknowledged, truly acknowledged, without words, without expectation, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the forest itself held its breath around them, the faint rustle of leaves and distant night sounds, fading into the background as something far more important unfolded in silence. And then slowly, carefully, Lucian lifted his hand, mirroring her motion without thinking, until his palm hovered just above hers, close enough that the warmth between them intensified, a steady pulse passing back and forth like a quiet conversation neither of them had been taught, but both somehow understood, and his brow tightened slightly, not in confusion this time, but in realization, because the more he focused on it, the clearer it became. This was not new. This connection had been there before, faint and overlooked, buried beneath assumptions he had never questioned. And he exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling heavily in his chest as memory began to shift, reshaping itself around what he now felt instead of what he had believed. And Elena watched him, her gaze steady, searching, as if she could sense that shift within him, as if she could feel the moment his certainty began to break apart. And something fragile stirred within her in response, something that had been buried beneath years of silence and dismissal, something that dared, just for a second, to hope. And the thought startled her, because hope had always been the most dangerous thing of all, and she lowered her hand slightly, the distance between them returning by a fraction, as if testing whether the connection would fade without that closeness. But it did not. It remained, steady, present, threading between them in a way that made her chest tighten again, and Lucian noticed the movement, the hesitation, and something in his expression shifted, softer now, more aware, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not authority, but intention. I was wrong. The words simple, unadorned, but heavier than anything he had said before, and they lingered in the air between them, not as a command, not as a declaration, but as something offered, something real. And Elena's breath caught, her fingers curling slightly at her side as the meaning settled in, not fully trusted, not yet accepted, but no longer dismissed. And she did not respond with sound, could not respond with sound, but the warmth between them shifted, deepened, as if acknowledging the truth in his words, and Lucian felt it immediately, the subtle change, the quiet acceptance that came not from hearing, but from being felt. And it struck him then, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that he had spent his entire life listening for voices, for declarations, for power spoken aloud, and in doing so, he had ignored the one presence that had been reaching him all along without ever making a sound. And the realization did not come with pride, but with something far heavier, something that settled into his chest like a weight he could not ignore. And for the first time, the Alpha King did not look at the Omega before him and see weakness. He saw something he did not yet fully understand, something he had nearly lost without ever knowing its value. And the silence between them no longer felt empty, but filled with everything he had failed to hear. The forest seemed to breathe differently now, as if it had accepted what was unfolding between them. And Elena Whitmore felt it in the way the air settled against her skin, no longer heavy with isolation, but filled with something steadier, something that did not vanish the moment she stepped into it. And yet her chest remained tight, not with fear, but with caution, because this moment, as real as it felt, stood on fragile ground, built on words that had come too late to erase what had already been done. And she lowered her gaze for a brief second, her fingers curling inward as if holding on to something unseen, something she had learned to protect long before he had ever noticed her. And Lucian saw it, the hesitation, the distance that still remained despite the connection that now bound them in silence. And it settled into him with a weight he could not dismiss, because for the first time he understood that recognition did not undo rejection, that awareness did not erase absence. And the realization forced him to step back, not physically, but inwardly, examining the certainty he had always carried as truth and finding the cracks within it widening. And he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but deliberate, grounding himself before he spoke again, not as a king, but as a man who had finally begun to listen. I do not know how to fix what I have already broken. And the honesty in his voice lacked the authority that once defined it, replaced instead with something far more uncertain, far more real. And Elena felt it immediately, the difference in tone, in intention, and it stirred something within her that she could not fully name, something that balanced between doubt and the smallest, most fragile thread of trust. And she lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes, not searching for power this time, but for truth. And what she found there was not perfect, not complete, but it was no longer empty. And the silence between them shifted once more, no longer just connection, but choice. And for the first time, Elena realized that she was no longer standing here because she had been drawn without control, but because she had chosen not to walk away. And that understanding settled into her with quiet strength, steadying her in a way she had never felt before. And she took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, enough to remind both of them that this moment belonged to more than just what he had discovered. It belonged to her as well. And Lucian noticed the shift instantly, the subtle boundary drawn without words, and instead of closing the distance again, he respected it, remaining where he stood, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but grounded in something more balanced, more aware. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, neither of them moved, yet everything between them continued to unfold, layer by layer, through presence alone. And in that stillness, Lucian began to understand something that no lesson had ever taught him, that power was not always found in control, that connection was not always spoken, and that the one he had once dismissed as nothing had become the only truth he could no longer ignore. And as the moonlight shifted through the branches above, casting soft patterns across the ground between them, the path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, it was no longer shaped by assumption, but by the quiet, undeniable reality of two souls learning how to meet in a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The silence between them did not fade, but it changed, deepening into something steadier, something that no longer felt uncertain but unfinished. And Elena Whitmore felt it in the way her heartbeat slowed, not from comfort, but from clarity, because for the first time in her life, she understood that this moment was not about being chosen, it was about choosing, and that realization grounded her in a way nothing else ever had. And she turned slightly, her gaze drifting past Lucian toward the deeper stretch of forest behind her, where the shadows grew thicker and the world beyond the palace no longer reached. And without a word, she began to step away, her movement quiet but deliberate, not an escape, not a retreat, but a decision. And Lucian felt it instantly, the shift in direction, the subtle withdrawal that did not break the connection but stretched it, testing it. And something inside him tightened, not with panic, but with awareness, because he recognized that if he allowed this moment to pass without action, he would lose her again, not because she was taken, but because she had chosen to walk away. And this time, the fault would be entirely his. And he moved forward, not quickly, not forcefully, but with purpose, closing part of the distance she had just created, his voice steady when it reached her. Do not leave. The words simple, but carrying a weight he had never placed in a request before. And Elena paused, her steps slowing until she came to a complete stop, her back still turned to him, the silence stretching once more. But no longer empty, no longer passive, and she felt it again, that pull, that quiet thread between them that refused to break no matter how far she stepped. And it would have been easy to follow it, easy to turn back and let it guide her. But she did not move, not yet, because something within her demanded more than instinct, more than connection. It demanded truth, and Lucian understood that too, even without seeing her face, even without hearing a single word, because the silence between them had become something he could read, something he could no longer ignore or misunderstand. And he took another step forward, then another, until he stood just behind her, close enough to feel the faint warmth that surrounded her, but not close enough to claim it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something it never had before, not command, not certainty, but vulnerability. I spent my entire life listening for strength in what could be heard, and I failed to see what stood in front of me all along. And the words settled into the space between them, not demanding response, not forcing movement, but offering something he had never given before, understanding shaped by regret. And Elena's fingers curled slightly at her side, her breath catching for just a moment as the meaning reached her, not through sound, but through the same quiet connection that had always existed between them. And slowly, carefully, she turned back toward him, her eyes meeting his once more, and this time, there was something different in her gaze, not just caution, not just distance, but a question, unspoken but clear, asking not who he was as a king, but who he was now, standing here in the silence he had once dismissed. And Lucian held her gaze without looking away, without retreating into the certainty he had once worn like armor, because for the first time, he understood that this moment was not his to control, but his to earn. And the forest remained still around them, the moonlight shifting softly through the branches as two paths stood open between them, no longer defined by power or rank, but by the fragile, undeniable truth that silence had given them both a choice. And neither of them could walk forward without truly hearing what the other had never been able to say. The question in her eyes did not fade, and Lucian Blackthorn felt it settle into him with a weight far greater than any challenge he had ever faced, because this was not something he could answer with strength or command, not something he could resolve with a single decision or declaration. And for the first time in his life, he understood that silence demanded more than words. It demanded truth lived out in action. And he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself not as a king preparing to lead, but as a man standing before someone he had wronged, someone who now held the power to walk away without ever speaking a single word. And the thought did not anger him, did not provoke the instinct to control, but instead grounded him further in the reality of what this moment required. And he took a step back, not away from her, but away from the authority he had always carried, creating space that mirrored the distance she had once set. And then, without looking away from her, he lowered himself, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, until one knee met the forest floor, the movement steady and deliberate, and the world seemed to still around them, the faint rustle of leaves pausing as if even the forest itself recognized the significance of what he was doing. And Elena's breath caught, her chest tightening as her eyes widened slightly, because this was not something she had ever expected, not from him, not from anyone. And the sight of the Alpha King kneeling before her did not feel like power, did not feel like dominance reversed, but something far more unfamiliar, something that reached her in a way she could not ignore. And Lucian held that position, not out of obligation, but because it was the only way he knew to show what words alone could not carry. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, stripped of everything that had once made it untouchable. I cannot change what I said in that hall, and I cannot pretend I understood you then. He paused, the truth of it settling heavily between them, before continuing. But I understand now that I never listened, and I will not make that mistake again. And the words were not perfect, not polished, but they were real, shaped by the weight of realization rather than the certainty of pride. And Elena felt it, not just in the sound of his voice, but in the way the connection between them shifted, deepened, as if something within him had finally aligned with what she had always carried. And her fingers trembled slightly at her side, the instinct to step back battling with the pull that remained steady, constant. And for a moment she simply stood there, watching him, searching for any trace of the cold certainty he had shown before, any sign that this was another form of control, another decision made without truly seeing her. But she found none, only the quiet presence of someone who had finally begun to understand what he had once dismissed, and slowly, carefully, she took a step forward, the distance between them closing once more, not because he had asked, but because she had chosen. And as she moved, the connection between them strengthened, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but still unfinished, still waiting. And she stopped just in front of him, her gaze steady, her breathing even. And for the first time, she did not feel small, did not feel invisible, because in this moment, she was not standing in his shadow, she was standing before him as his equal. And though she still could not speak, the silence around her no longer felt like a limitation, but like a language of its own, one that he was finally learning to hear. And Lucian remained where he was, looking up at her not as a ruler looking down on his people, but as someone who had finally realized that the voice he had ignored was the only one that had ever truly reached him at all. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world narrowed to the quiet space between breath and heartbeat, where everything that had been broken, overlooked, and misunderstood now stood waiting, not for permission, but for truth. And Elena Whitmore felt it settle deep within her, that this was the moment that would define what came next, not because of who he was, but because of who she had become. And slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand again, not hesitating this time, not stopping. Inches away, but closing the distance fully until her palm rested lightly against his chest. And the connection that followed was immediate, stronger than anything before, a steady pulse that moved through both of them, as if something long silent had finally found its way into the open. And Lucian Blackthorne drew in a sharp breath, not from surprise, but from the clarity that came with it, because in that single touch, he felt everything he had missed, every quiet call he had ignored, every moment where she had reached out without sound and he had turned away. And the weight of it did not crush him, but it grounded him, anchoring him in a truth he could no longer escape. And he did not rise, did not reclaim the distance of authority, but remained where he was, allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was meant to, unguarded, honest, real. And Elena held his gaze, her eyes steady, no longer searching for acknowledgement, because she had already found it, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be spoken, only felt. And the silence between them shifted one final time, no longer filled with uncertainty or hesitation, but with decision. And she understood then that her voice had never been missing. It had simply never been heard. And now, for the first time, it was, not in sound, but in presence, in connection, in the undeniable way she stood before him without shrinking, without fading. And Lucian felt that change as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. And something within him responded, not as a king claiming what was his, but as someone choosing, fully aware of what that choice meant. And he placed his hand gently over hers where it rested against him, not trapping it, not claiming it, but meeting it, matching her presence with his own. And when he finally rose to his feet, the movement was slow, deliberate, bringing them to the same level, the distance between them equal, balanced. And the forest seemed to breathe again, the quiet returning not as absence, but as harmony. And for the first time since the night had begun, there was no pull, no absence,